At 10:47 a.m. on February 3, 1945, Captain Robert "Bob" Milikin's world shrank to the icy hiss of a failing oxygen mask. At 42,000 feet over the Bavarian Alps, in the thin -58-degree Fahrenheit air, his P-47D Thunderbolt's oxygen regulator gave out. He took a desperate breath and tasted only rubber and frost. Hypoxia's clock started ticking, around 12 seconds before his brain shut down. Vision would tunnel, fingers numb, then an uncontrolled dive into the German countryside, another statistic in Fighter Command's nightly reports. But his mission was absolute: protect the 72 B-17s below, carrying 970 men to bomb the Regensburg Messerschmitt plant. He couldn't descend, not yet. Through his blurred canopy, he spotted them, 3 sleek silhouettes climbing 3,000 feet below. Not ordinary fighters, but Focke-Wulf Ta 152Hs, the Luftwaffe's new high-altitude predators. With pressurized cockpits and powerful engines, they thrived where Americans struggled to breathe. In 4 minutes, they'd be in firing range, shredding the defenseless bombers with 30mm cannons. Milikin's mind raced through the brutal math. Descend to breathe, and the bombers die. Stay and pass out, and the bombers die. His hand moved not to the radio for help, but to a small, repositioned valve near his knee, an emergency oxygen bottle he'd rigged for quick access. He turned it on, drawing a thin, life-saving stream. He bought himself 2 minutes. The regulations said descend. He pushed the stick forward, his Thunderbolt nosing into a silent dive toward the climbing Germans. The first rule of combat overrode all manuals: protect the bombers, even if it meant fighting on borrowed air. By February 1945, the U.S. 8th Air Force faced a silent crisis. The newly deployed Focke-Wulf 152H was not just another fighter, it was a systemic weapon, exploiting a precise altitude band, above 38,000 feet. Here, American bomber formations became vulnerable, and their escorts, the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, were crippled not by enemy guns, but by human physiology. While the Ta 152H's pressurized cockpit allowed its pilot to fight effectively, the American pilot's body began to betray him. Oxygen systems designed for lower altitudes faltered, regulators froze, seals cracked, and pressure dropped in the near vacuum. The official time of useful consciousness at 42,000 feet was a chilling 9 to 15 seconds, barely enough to register the problem before blackout. Between December 1944 and February 1945, these interceptors had claimed 47 B-17s at high altitude, representing 470 airmen lost. The math was clear, and it was devastating. Fighter Command's response was a rigid regulation, underlined in red in every pilot's manual: descend immediately if oxygen fails above 35,000 feet. The logic from headquarters was coldly sensible: an unconscious pilot is worthless, a crashed plane a total loss. But this doctrine ignored combat geometry. To protect the bombers, escorts had to maintain altitude advantage. Staying between the enemy and the bombers meant lingering in that lethal zone where oxygen systems were unreliable. Pilots like Milikin understood the unspoken calculus. The risk to 16 fighter pilots was preferable to the slaughter of 720 bomber crewmen. It was an intolerable gamble, forcing men to choose between following orders and fulfilling their mission. The problem was deemed insoluble by command, leaving pilots on the front line to wrestle with the impossible equation of physics, physiology, and duty, with every labored breath at the edge of the stratosphere.
Robert Milikin wasn't born a fighter pilot. He was forged on a struggling wheat farm outside Boise, Idaho during the Great Depression. His world was one of machinery that broke and couldn't be replaced. The most crucial lesson came from his father, Thomas, during a harrowing harvest. Their tractor's engine seized on a steep slope, sending 7,000 pounds of steel sliding backward toward a ravine. Instead of jumping clear, his father stayed. He wrestled the dead steering wheel, angling the powerless tractor sideways to use friction and gravity against the slope. They stopped just short of the edge. Young Robert internalized the principle: when machinery fails, you don't panic. You find what still works and use it. This farm boy pragmatism, a deep instinctual understanding of physics, leverage, and controlled failure, would become his combat doctrine. It was a mindset utterly foreign to the academy-trained officers he'd later serve with, but far more attuned to the brutal realities of a straining aircraft at 42,000 feet. Milikin joined the Army Air Corps in 1942 with no college degree, just a formidable mechanical aptitude. While other cadets mastered aerial maneuvers, he obsessed over technical manuals, understanding how the P-47 systems interdependently failed. His crew chief, Master Sergeant Tony Esposito, noted, "Captain Milikin treats his aircraft like farm equipment. He knows what breaks, what doesn't, and what keeps working." By 1945, with 53 missions, Milikin was known not for reckless aggression, but for meticulous energy management, the art of converting altitude to speed and position. Squadron mates teased the professor for his pre-mission calculations, but those calculations brought him and his wingmen home repeatedly. He was a pilot who thought in vectors and torque long before he thought in glory. A man prepared not just to fly a machine, but to salvage a failing one in the midst of combat, a skill born on an Idaho hillside.
4 days before the fateful mission, during a solo training flight over the North Sea, Milikin's oxygen regulator began to fail intermittently at 38,000 feet. Instead of an immediate emergency descent, he became a scientist of his own impairment. The cycle was precise: 10 seconds of airflow, then 5 seconds of nothing. He timed it. He practiced measured breaths during the flow, then held his breath during the cuts, fighting the instinct to panic. He discovered he could stretch his useful consciousness beyond the manual's 12-second warning, closer to 25 seconds if he was prepared. This was heresy against all safety doctrine, but it planted a radical idea. What could a pilot do with 25 seconds? Back at RAF Boxstead, he filed no report. Reporting it would ground him, and the problem, the German TA-152s, would not go away. Instead, he began his own covert research and development program. His first modification was physical. He repositioned his small emergency bailout oxygen bottle from its regulation storage, securing it where his left hand could find and activate the valve in under 2 seconds. His crew chief, Sergeant Esposito, noticed. "Regulations specify storage in the survival pack, sir," he stated flatly. Milikin met his gaze. "Regulations also say don't fly with faulty oxygen systems. Sometimes you need equipment accessible when systems fail." Esposito, a 26-year maintenance veteran, understood the silent language of survival and asked no more questions. Next came flight testing. On February 1st, Milikin climbed to 41,000 feet, throttled back, and glided. He charted descent rates and control response. A powerless P-47, he confirmed, could glide over 2 miles horizontally for every 1,000 feet of altitude, and it remained controllable. An aircraft could be a weapon even without engine power if gravity was harnessed. He now had a theory and a tool, but no idea if either would work when 3 enemy fighters were climbing toward him at 400 miles per hour. The confrontation erupted the day before the mission. In a smoke-filled briefing room at RAF Boxstead, Major Frank Henderson laid out the grim reality for his senior pilots. Intelligence confirmed TAN 152H interceptors would be waiting above 38,000 feet along the Regensburg corridor. Captain William Sorensen, the by-the-book executive officer, voiced the collective dread. Why us? Why not send P-51 groups? Henderson's tight jaw gave the unspoken answer. They were expendable. It was then that Milikin broke protocol. Major, what if we intercept them during their climb? He moved to the map, explaining that the German fighters were vulnerable while laboring upward. To achieve this, their P-47s would have to loiter at an insane 42,000 feet directly in the oxygen failure zone, then convert that altitude into diving attacks. The room erupted in protest. Sorensen slammed his hand on the desk. You're proposing we gamble our lives on 60% system reliability. Milikin stood firm. We're gambling 720 bomber crewmen if we don't. Henderson, intrigued but furious, pressed him on the fatal flaw. And when our oxygen fails before the Germans appear? Milikin hesitated, unable to reveal his secret experiments with gliding and consciousness. Standard emergency descent applies, sir. A tense silence followed. Henderson saw the unspoken calculation in Milikin's eyes. There was more to this plan. With profound reluctance, he approved a 4-plane element under Milikin's lead. You have a 5-minute window at 42,000 feet. Oxygen problems, you descend immediately. Anyone who passes out and crashes will be posthumously charged with stupidity. The order was given. The unorthodox, forbidden tactic was now official, born from a desperate debate where the only worse option was to do nothing.
February 3rd, 10:47 a.m. Milikin's 4-ship element held at 42,000 feet. The P-47s sluggish in the thin air. The call came from radar. Bandits, low and climbing. Moments later, his wingman spotted them. 3 TA-152Hs at 39,000 feet, rising toward the bombers. Milikin took a breath to give the attack order. Nothing. The main oxygen system had failed. Without hesitation, his left hand found the emergency bottle valve, flipping it open. A thin, cold stream hit his lungs. He had bought perhaps 90 seconds. Transmitting a calm order, he pushed the stick forward. His thunderbolt nosed into a dive, converting precious altitude into screaming speed. The Germans, still looking down for the bombers, didn't see him coming. At 450 miles per hour, his guns roared, stitching the lead German fighter. It disintegrated. He broke toward the second, his vision already graying at the edges, the emergency gauge dropping fast. A second burst sent another TA-152 spinning away. Then the oxygen flow sputtered and died. The gray tunnel closed to a pinhole. His last conscious act was to center the third enemy in his sights and fire. Hypoxia claimed him completely at 37,000 feet. His hands fell limp, his head slumped. Captain Robert Milikin was now clinically unconscious, a passenger in his own fighter. Yet the aircraft, trimmed in a steep dive and holding over 400 miles per hour, continued on a ballistic path. The surviving German pilot, seeing the P-47 screaming down, broke hard to evade. This energy-bleeding turn was a fatal mistake against an opponent who no longer felt G-forces or fear. Milikin's unconscious P-47 did not turn. It followed a pure, predictable physics arc. The two aircraft converged at 34,000 feet. Here, atmospheric pressure crossed a critical threshold. Rushing air bled into the cockpit, and the starved brain, receiving just enough oxygen, sparked back to life. Milikin's eyes flickered open to a disorienting blur of sky and a German fighter filling his windscreen. Muscle memory, drilled through 100 training sessions, took over. His thumb pressed the trigger. A wild, unaimed burst at point-blank range shattered the TA-152's tail. He had shot down his third interceptor while technically dead to the world.
Pulling out of the dive at 31,000 feet, Milikin's vision cleared as the functioning oxygen regulator delivered steady flow. His hands shook violently on the stick. His wingman's voice, laced with shock, crackled in his headset. "Jesus Christ, Lead! I thought you were dead!" Milikin took 3 deliberate, agonizing breaths before keying his mic, forcing his voice into a flat calm. 2, Lead. Status. The reply confirmed the impossible. All 3 bandits were down, the bomber stream untouched. He had done it. But the cost was a secret he'd have to bury deeper than any oxygen line. He descended to rejoin the formation, running through instrument checks with robotic precision. Fuel, ammo, damage. The routine was a lifeline back to reality, a way to cage the tremor in his soul. He had not just cheated death, he had weaponized his own unconsciousness, and that truth was more dangerous than any German fighter. Back at RAF Boxted, Sergeant Esposito met him on the tarmac, his mechanic's eyes missing nothing. "Sir, gun camera confirms 3 kills. Congratulations." He paused, studying Milikin's pale, drawn face. "You look like hell." Milikin offered a hollow, "just tired." But Esposito's 26 years of service recognized the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd crossed a line. Later, during debriefing, Major Henderson reviewed the gun camera footage, the eerie, unwavering dive of Milikin's P-47 after what should have been blackout. He pulled the captain aside. "Your attack was unusual, almost like you were unconscious part of the way. Explain." Milikin held his gaze, the lie now a necessary part of the mission. "Oxygen functioned normally, sir. Standard attack. Got lucky." Henderson stared, knowing he was hearing a carefully constructed half-truth. With a slow nod, he chose the survival of his men over strict adherence to doctrine. "Sometimes, Captain, I don't want to know the details. You brought everyone home. That's what matters." That night, Milikin wrote a brief letter to his father in Idaho, referencing the tractor on the slope, thanking him for a lesson that saved his life. He mailed it, knowing his father would read between the lines and burn it. Some victories could only exist in the quiet space between regulation and reality. Captain Robert Milikin flew 23 more missions before the war ended, his total reaching 12 confirmed kills and a distinguished flying cross. He never spoke of February 3rd. In September 1945, he returned to the Idaho wheat farm, hung up his wings, and never piloted an aircraft again. To reporters and neighbors, he was simply a veteran who had done his job. The war became a closed book. The lesson from the tractor, control what you can when systems fail, now applied to harvests and machinery, not diving thunderbolts. His extraordinary act, a blend of farm boy physics, forbidden experimentation, and sheer will, remained buried, a confidential footnote in his own memory. The official Army Air Force's investigations into high-altitude combat eventually led to better oxygen systems and accessible emergency bottles, indirectly validating his desperate improvisation without ever knowing its origin story. In 1983, a researcher from the Air Force Historical Research Agency tracked down the 62-year-old former captain, hoping to document first-hand accounts of high-altitude tactics. Milikin politely declined the interview. "Son," he said, "what happened at 42,000 feet stays at 42,000 feet. Some things work better when they're not officially documented." As the researcher turned to leave, he offered one piece of information. Modern fighter pilots now carried their emergency oxygen bottles precisely positioned for instant access, a standard procedure born from hard lessons in the war. Milikin simply nodded. He didn't smile, offered no story, and returned to working his land. Captain Robert Milikin passed away in 2004 at age 83. His obituary listed his medals and kills. It did not mention that 3 of those kills were achieved in a state of unconsciousness, a silent testament to a truth he understood better than anyone. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't courage or technology, but a deep understanding of how to use what keeps working when everything else fails. That wasn't insanity. It was mathematics, learned on a farm and proven in the thin, frozen air over Germany.